Could I inquire as to how much time we have left?
14 minutes.
Oh. Well, I yield myself as so much time as I may need. And, Mr. Speaker, let me first of all say I have enormous respect for the ranking member, and he has done an admirable job today, as he always does, of defending the President and the President's actions in Guantanamo Bay. Unfortunately, the President's actions in Guantanamo Bay have not been quite as admirable. We have heard throughout the discussion today several catchphrases. We have heard that we wanted to discuss what was actually true. We wanted to discuss what the facts actually were. We talked about this incredible vetting process this administration had. We talked about the need to have a process and to have that process work before you took action. We've heard the phrase, we don't want to turn the American justice system on its ears. And we've also heard that we don't want to hold up the process for a few months because that could be problematic. Well, Mr. Speaker, let me try to take us back a little bit and put some facts around this whole debate as to why we got here in the first place. The reality of this situation is that this administration, before they ever took office, before the President ever raised his hand and took the oath, before any cabinet members were appointed or before anybody had been placed in his administration, this President, this Vice President made a commitment to close Guantanamo Bay before they ever went down there and actually investigated and looked at what was there. The other situation is that when they made that promise, they had made no vetting process. They had no process in place. The other fact is this, Mr. Speaker, that when this President raised that hand and took that oath, the former administration that my good friend, the ranking member, has talked about how terrible they were, they had a prosecutor and a team of prosecutors who were prosecuting some of the worst terrorists this country had ever seen. Most Americans don't know the names of the people in Guantanamo Bay, but they know we had co-conspirators in 9/11 who were sitting down there, and that former administration had a prosecutorial team who had gone through months after months after months with the stack of motions this high, and that prosecutor said to anyone who would go down there, including me and the former chairman of the committee, Ike Skelton, that he would have had guilty verdicts or guilty pleas by those co-conspirators within 6 months. When this administration came in with their great vetting and their great process, without talking to that prosecutor, without looking at that at all, he disbanded that entire prosecution, terminated that prosecutor, terminated that entire team, and to this day, no one on that side of the aisle can even tell us when they are going to have convictions on those conspirators of the worst terrorists this country has ever seen. And you know, when I hear the President and the Vice President stand up and say, we haven't given up on the promise to close Guantanamo Bay, I listen and I listen and I listen to deafness for the President or the Vice President to say, we haven't given up on getting convictions of the worst terrorists in the United States. And so when I look at Guantanamo Bay and I hear we're not really going to close it, forget what the President's saying, forget what the Vice President, they don't really mean they want to close Guantanamo Bay. All they want to do is bring those terrorists to the United States. And we have stood on this floor and fought that for 8 years. And here's the reason. Because let me ask which of you want those terrorists brought to your community with every single act of terrorism we are seeing now and the repercussions of that, because the moment you put them in your community, in any jail or any prison, it's not a matter of whether we can hold them there, but you have just put a target on every school, every business, every mall in that community. When you talk about justice and you talk about fairness, we just believe that's wrong. And so when you talk about just giving a little more time to the President for a few months, doesn't it make a little bit of sense that if this administration was given the time to come in and stop the prosecution of the worst terrorists the United States has ever seen, that maybe, just maybe, we ought to have a temporary hold and let the next president, whoever that president might be, have a few months to determine before we release these terrorists whether or not they want to prosecute them and they really want to bring them to a conviction instead of just talking about it for 8 years. And then let me close, Mr. Speaker, with this. Years ago, when I stood on this floor on one of the first motions we had, was a motion to recommit for the Defense Authorization Bill to stop this administration from bringing these detainees to the United States. My friend and then the chairman on the other side of the aisle, Ike Skelton, stood on the floor right where my good friend Mr. Smith is sitting today, and Mr. Skelton said this. He said, when it comes to terrorism, there shouldn't be any light between the Republicans and the Democrats. And he supported that motion not to bring those terrorists to the United States. So, Mr. Speaker, today, after all the rhetoric, it is a pretty simple deal. Prosecute them if you want to prosecute them, but don't fulfill some campaign promise of shutting down Guantanamo Bay and the impact that could have on these terrorists. And I would say, as my good friend Ike Skelton said today, there shouldn't be any light between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to terrorists. But there certainly shouldn't be any light in any member of this Congress when it comes to defending and protecting the United States from these terrorists who have one goal in mind, and that is to kill Americans. And so with that, Mr. Speaker, I hope that we'll support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 863, the previous question is ordered on the bill as amended. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill to prohibit the transfer of any individual detained at United States Naval Station, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba.
The question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.